in the quiet town of Snowbell Winter. Didn't arrive, it settled like it planned. To stay, the snow didn't fall in playful flurries, it drifted in silence, layering rooftops and softening the sound of the world. The trees stood heavy under ice, and the roads curved gently around frozen fields where no one played anymore. At the end of Willow Bend Lane, in a yellow house with peeling shutters and a porch swing that no longer moved, Nova Elkins sat bundled in a red coat, 2 sizes too big. She wore it even indoors. Even when the fire was lit, she hadn't laughed in a long time, not since the world had shifted beneath her feet. Nova was 7, but her eyes felt older, gray and watchful, always tracing the edges of silence. Her father, Daniel Elkins, had been a firefighter, the kind who ran into burning buildings when others ran out. He never made it home from his last call. A wildfire, they said, a collapsed beam. A town mourned, a little girl folded into herself. Her mother, Elise, once a school art teacher, lay in a hospital bed now, her breath soft and uncertain after a car accident that left more questions than answers. And in the house, Mark Doyle, the man Nova was told to call Dad, moved through rooms with heavy steps and quiet eyes. He wasn't cruel, not at first, just distant, tidy, cold like the windows in January. The warmth, Nova remembered, had vanished. All that remained was the weight of snow and the sound of nothing. 3 days before the snowstorm hit hardest, a knock came at the door. Nova heard it from the hallway, 2 short taps, then one long, not the kind of knock that demanded, but one that waited. Mark didn't move from his chair, eyes fixed on the television, so Nova opened the door herself. A man stood there, bundled in a worn parka and thick scarf. His beard was peppered with gray, and he leaned slightly to the left as if the cold had twisted something inside his bones. But his eyes, they were warm. "Hey, Nova," he said gently, "remember me?" She blinked. She did not really, but something in her chest stirred, a memory not of his face but of the stories her dad used to tell. This was Mateo Ruiz, her father's old friend, a park ranger who'd once camped with Daniel in the mountains and who had promised something years ago that now weighed in his hands. He held out a box. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine with tiny holes poked in the sides. The air around it puffed softly, warm and faintly sweet. Nova took a slow step forward. Her fingers brushed the lid as Mateo whispered, "Your dad made me promise if anything ever happened to him, I'd find you the brightest, bravest pup I could." Inside the box, nestled in an old fleece blanket, was a German Shepherd puppy, barely 8 weeks old. His fur was the color of soft earth and new sunlight. He blinked slowly at her, then gave a half yawn, half whimper, and nudged his nose into her palm. Nova's breath caught in her throat. The ache in her chest softened. "I'll call him Sonny," she said, almost afraid the words would break if spoken too loud, "because he feels warm." Ooh smiled, and for a moment even the house behind her didn't feel so cold. Mark appeared in the doorway behind them, arms crossed. His face didn't change. "Dog," he said flatly. Nova didn't answer. She was too busy cradling Sonny to her chest, already afraid to let go. The days after Sonny arrived were different, not louder, not brighter, but softer somehow. The house still creaked in the cold, and the radiator still hissed like a tired breath, but now there were new sounds. Paws tapping across the floor, gentle huffs as Sonny explored each room with careful curiosity. He followed Nova everywhere. When she read books by the front window, Sonny curled at her feet, nose tucked into her socks. When she walked slowly around the kitchen, tracing tiles with her toes, he walked behind her, never straying far. At night, while Mark snored in his chair with the news still playing, Nova would sneak Sonny up the stairs and let him sleep at the foot of her bed. Sonny never barked. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, a silent guardian a gentle listener a reason to wake up each morning. Nova began to talk. Again, but only to him she whispered her fears into his ears, told him stories about her dad, about the dreams she used to have, where her mom came home with a balloon and said, "Let's go somewhere warm." She told him about the pine tree in the backyard and how her dad used to hang little paper stars from the branches when life got too heavy. Sonny listened like no one else ever had. His ears tilted, his eyes watched, his head tilted just so, as if the weight of her secrets mattered. Mark noticed the change. He didn't like it. At dinner he watched Nova with a tight jaw, his fork scraping the plate like a warning. "You're getting too attached," he muttered one evening. "It's just a dog." Nova didn't answer. She reached under the table and brushed her hand against Sonny's fur, warm, steady. When the snowstorm hit and the power flickered, Sonny didn't flinch. He stood between Nova and the window, as if even the wind had to answer to him, and for the first time in weeks Nova smiled in her sleep, not because the pain had gone, but because she had someone who stayed. It happened on a Tuesday. The snow had thickened overnight, muffling the world in white. The wind moaned through the eaves like something lost. Inside the house, Nova sat cross-legged on the rug near the fireplace, building towers out of old wooden blocks. Sonny lay beside her, chin resting on his paws, ears twitching at each creak of the floor. Mark came home early that day, boots heavy with snow, breath sharp with cold. He shook off his coat in the entryway and walked in, eyes immediately narrowing at the sight of Sonny inside. "I told you," he said, voice flat. "No dogs in the house." Nova froze, her hands still on a block. Sonny didn't move. He just looked up at Mark, tail still, eyes calm. "He's not doing anything," Nova said quietly. "It's cold out there. He was shivering last night." Mark stepped forward. "It's a dog, Nova, not a child. It doesn't belong in the living room or the kitchen or anywhere near the couch." Before Nova could reply, Mark snapped his fingers and pointed toward the back door. Outside now, Sonny didn't move until Nova stood. She didn't argue, just walked to the door with her head low, opened it, and watched her best friend step into the cold. Mark tossed a thin blanket onto the back porch. "That'll do," he muttered. That night Nova crept out when the house had gone still. She wrapped Sonny in her old baby quilt and sat beside him in the shed. No flashlight, no words, just two small souls breathing quietly in the dark. And though her cheeks were red from the cold, she whispered, "I'll stay with you as long as I have to." The wind howled like a warning. It was the kind of cold that didn't sting. It sank into walls, into windows, into bones. The power had flickered twice that morning. The sky was pale, colorless, and cruel. Nova stood at the sink, washing the same cup for the third time. Sonny lying behind her by the vent where the last bit of warm air escaped. Mark came into the kitchen, glanced at the floor, then stopped there. Faint but visible were paw prints on the rug. Sonny's, the last time Nova had let him in. She hadn't cleaned it well enough. Her fingers tightened on the cup. "I told you," Mark said, his voice low and sharp, like a blade. "No dogs in the house." He didn't yell, that was worse. He grabbed Sonny by the scruff, not rough enough to injure, but hard enough to frighten, and pulled him toward the back door. Nova dropped the cup. "Stop!" she cried, chasing after him. "Please." He didn't mean he was cold. "I didn't." But Mark didn't turn around. He moved with purpose, boots crunching through snow, breath rising like smoke. Nova followed him out into the bitter wind, coat unzipped, gloves forgotten, feet slipping as she ran. They crossed the backyard, through the open gate, and into the park where the old maple tree stood, its trunk wide and bark cracked with age. Mark pulled a frayed rope from his pocket. Without a word he tied it around Sonny's neck and fastened The other end to the tree. The dog didn't resist, he just looked back at Nova. Confused but calm, trusting their mark. Muttered, "Let him freeze with your lies." Nova let out a sound, small, sharp, broken. Not quite a scream, but close. Mark turned to her eyes hard. "You say one word about this and I'll send him to the pound. See how long he lasts there." Then he walked away, disappearing into the white. Nova waited only until he was out of sight. Then she ran, knees sinking in snow, hands trembling as she fumbled at the knot. It wouldn't come loose. Her fingers were too cold, too small. She did the only thing she could. She dropped to the ground, wrapped her arms around Sonny and curled herself around his shivering body. The snow fell harder, her breath grew short, and somewhere beneath the tree a little girl gave all the warmth she had left. From the window of her small blue house across the street, Riley Bloom was washing dishes when she saw something that didn't belong. At first it looked like a pile of snow beneath the maple tree. Then the wind shifted and she noticed movement, barely a small shape, a flicker of golden fur, a flash of red fabric too thin for this kind of cold. Her heart skipped. Without a coat, without shoes, Riley bolted from the kitchen, grabbing only a scarf and her boots. Half-laced, she slipped once on the front steps, caught herself, then sprinted across the icy street, snow slicing at her cheeks. When she reached the tree, she dropped to her knees. "Nova," she whispered. The little girl didn't respond. She was curled around the German shepherd, her face buried in its fur, arms stiff but protective. The dog whimpered softly, lifting his head just enough to acknowledge Riley's presence before collapsing again. Riley worked fast. She unwrapped her scarf, bundled it around Nova, then gathered the child into her arms. Nova was frighteningly light. The cold had sunk into her skin, into her bones. She didn't shiver anymore. That was the worst sign. Riley tucked the puppy into her coat, cradled both like fragile fire, and rushed back to the house. Inside, the warmth hit like sunlight. She laid Nova on the couch, wrapped her in layers of blankets, and placed the dog, still unnamed in her world, on a towel-line basket by the fire. His breathing was shallow but steady. Riley called Mrs. Heller, a retired nurse who lived 2 doors down. Within minutes the older woman arrived, her thick gray braid tucked under a wool hat, hands steady with purpose. "She's hypothermic," Mrs. Heller said, checking Nova's pulse, "but she'll come around." Riley didn't answer. She was kneeling beside the couch, staring at Nova's tiny hands, still curled, still clinging to something that wasn't there. She didn't cry, she just stayed, and for the first time in days, Nova was warm again. The snow had eased, but the silence hadn't. Nova had been staying with Riley for nearly a week. Her cheeks had regained color, and her voice, though still quiet, no longer trembled. But something restless lived behind her eyes, a question she hadn't asked aloud. One afternoon, while Riley was meeting with a woman from social services, Mrs. Teller stayed with Nova. The retired nurse moved about Riley's kitchen like she'd lived there for years, heating up soup and humming old hymns. That's when Nova asked, "Can I go home for a little bit?" Mrs. Heller paused, reading more in the tone than the words. "You sure?" Nova nodded. "There's something I need to find." They walked slowly across the road. The yellow house looked smaller now, quieter. Mark was gone. The locks had been changed. The silence inside felt like a room holding its breath. Nova climbed the stairs. Her boots thudded softly on the old wooden steps as she made her way to the hallway closet. Above it, the attic hatch. She dragged over a chair and pushed it open. The ladder creaked, but she climbed. The attic smelled of cedar and winter dust. She knew exactly what she was looking for. In the far corner, beneath a moth-eaten quilt and a broken lamp, sat a wooden box she remembered from when she was 4. Inside were old photos, fire Department patches and letters tied neatly with green string and one envelope marked in her father's handwriting for Nova when you're ready. She sat on the floor cross-legged and opened it slowly. Sweetheart, if you're reading this, then I'm not there, but I need you to know I never left you, not really. I'm with you in every brave thing you do. Some people will pretend to care just to control. Don't trust their voices. Trust your own, it's stronger than you think. Love always, Dad. Nova closed her eyes and held the letter to her chest. Then she stood, climbed back down, and told Mrs. Tell her, I'm ready to go now. The woman who arrived at Riley's door wore a navy ghoul coat and carried a leather folder. Her name was Karen Whitmore, a social worker from the county's child safety unit. She spoke with calm eyes, the kind that had seen too much but still cared enough to stay soft. Riley offered her tea. Nova sat at the kitchen table, her hands cooped around a mug of warm cocoa. Sonny lay at her feet, his head resting gently on her slippers. Aaron smiled gently. Nova, I'm here to help, but only if you're ready to talk. Nova looked at Riley, who gave her a small nod. She looked down at Sonny, who gave no signal but stayed perfectly still, like he always did when she needed courage. Then she reached into her coat pocket and placed the letter on the table. Karen unfolded it slowly, reading Daniel Ellen's handwriting in silence. Her expression changed just slightly, but her eyes didn't leave the page until the end. Did he hurt you? Karen asked softly. Nova didn't flinch. Not with fists, she said, but he took things. My voice, my safety, Sonny. Her voice didn't shake. And now, Nova reached down and stroked the soft fur between Sonny's ears. I got them back. Karen exhaled through her nose, quiet approval. You were brave to speak, Nova. Nova shook her head. I was brave to survive. Speaking was just remembering I could. Nothing more needed to be said. Outside the wind had softened. Spring didn't arrive all at once in Snowbell. It came slowly, like someone learning to trust again. The snow melted in patches. The wind lost its bite. Crocuses poked through the softening ground like tiny hands reaching for light. And in the backyard of the yellow house at the end of Willowbend Lane, something else began to bloom. Nova stood beneath the tall pine tree, the one her father used to call the star tree. Its branches still held a few paper stars, faded and fragile, whispering in the breeze like memories that hadn't forgotten. Beside her, Sonny sat tall and quiet, his fur now thicker, stronger, golden brown and dusted with pine needles. He was no longer the trembling pup from a box. He was part of her world, her anchor, her shadow, her warmth. In Nova's mittened hands was a new star cut from silver paper, edges slightly uneven, but shining under the soft morning sun. She tied it with twine and hung it low, where Sonny could see it. This one's for you, she said quietly from the porch. Elise watched, bundled in a knitted shawl. Her recovery was slow but steady. The doctors had called it a miracle. She called it her daughter's voice pulling her home. That evening Riley handed Nova a printed page, the article she had written, titled, When a Child Saves a Dog, and the Dog Saves Her Right Back. It would be published in the local paper. The next day Nova read it silently, then folded it in half and placed it on the bookshelf next to her dad's letter, now framed in pine. That night she and Sonny curled up together beneath a soft quilt. There were no nightmares, just quiet, just breathing, and somewhere in the tree above, the stars swayed gently like they were proud